Family therapists, what's the darkest secret you've ever been expected to keep? I was working with the Sinclair family when the youngest daughter whispered, "I don't like when mommy plays the breathing game anymore." Mrs. Sinclair's hand shot out, gripping Adelaide's shoulder. "That's just pretend, sweetie. Remember what we discussed about keeping family games private?" Her voice raised. I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds interesting. Can you tell me how to play?" The older sister Penelope looked like she was holding back tears. Mrs. Sinclair's eyes widened. "Oh, it's just a silly bedtime routine." Adelaide beamed with pride. "Mommy puts the pillow on our faces and counts. I can last 73 seconds now." "Adelaide, that's enough. We practice for when important people visit. The bathtub game helps us hold our breath longer underwater." Adelaide continued, warming to her subject. Mrs. M. Sinclair stood abruptly, yanking Adelaide and Penelope to their feet. "I think we've taken enough of the doctor's time." She was already moving toward the door, dragging both girls. "Mrs. Sinclair, we still have 40 minutes. Send me the bill." She didn't look back. I filed my CPS report within the hour, and my supervisor called me an hour later. "Maria, you need to be very careful about making accusations against respected community members. The Sinclairs donate to half the city council's campaigns." I tried to argue, but she cut me off. "Drop it. That's not a request." At dawn, I drove past their house just to check. A for sale sign stood in the yard and I called the number. "Oh, the Sinclairs? They're relocating immediately. Something about a business opportunity out of state." I went back that afternoon with a tin of cookies as my excuse to knock on the door. Mrs. Sinclair answered in yellow rubber gloves that went up to her elbows. The smell of bleach made me lightheaded. "I forgot to give these to Adelaide yesterday," I said with a smile. She mentioned she liked chocolate chip. "The girls aren't here," she shot quickly. "They're at their aunt's house." But her children's shoes sat by the door, still wet, and behind her I could hear rhythmic thumping, like someone hitting a wall in a pattern. That's when her phone buzzed on the entry table. The preview notification was visible for just a second. "Handler expecting 2 packages tomorrow morning. Confirm the condition." Over her shoulder, I could see boxes stacked in the hallway. Mountain House written in black marker. I knew the area. Rural, isolated, no cell service. Perfect for hiding things. "I have things to do," Mrs. Sinclair spat, starting to close the door. "The moving truck will be here tomorrow morning." It was 8:15 p.m. I had less than 12 hours to work with. As she shifted, her keys fell from her pocket. The keyring had medical tape and zip ties attached. "Let me help." I bent to pick them up, glimpsing the trash can outside. Empty bottles of pediatric sleep medication. Adelaide's doll lay on the porch. Someone had cut off all its hair and drawn red marks across its face. Mrs. Sinclair grabbed the keys from my hand. "You need to leave. Now." The only way to stop the girls disappearing forever was to get a confession. I tried one more time, blocking her from closing the door. "Mrs. Sinclair, please. I know something's wrong. Let me help." She laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "Help? You sent CPS here. Get off my property before I call the police." I grabbed her wrist as she tried to shut the door. "Where are Adelaide and Penelope right now? Just tell me they're safe." The door slammed. I heard deadbolts turning. That night, I did the only thing I could think of. I called my brother Marco. "Remember what Uncle Harold did to us?" He didn't need more. "Give me 20 minutes." Marco arrived with his friend Miguel. They'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan together. By 2 a.m., we were outside the Sinclair house with everything we needed. Marco picked the lock in under 30 seconds and crept inside. Mrs. Sinclair was packing a suitcase, her back to us. Mrs. Sinclair woke up 10 minutes later to Marco's hand over her mouth, and 3 figures dressed in black surrounding her bed. She tried to scream, but the sock Miguel shoved in prevented that. That's when I pulled up a chair directly in front of her. "I'm going to take the sock out of your mouth," I said, placing Marco's knife against her cheek. "And you're going to tell me exactly what you've been doing to Adelaide and Penelope. Every detail of these games." I slowly removed the sock. Her eyes went wild the second the sock came out, darting between Marco at the window and Miguel standing behind me and then back to my face. She started shaking her head fast, trying to talk, but the words came out all jumbled together about how we didn't understand, and they made her do it, and she never wanted any of this. I leaned in closer until our faces were maybe 6 inches apart. Start from the beginning. Her whole body was trembling now, and tears were running down her face, making her makeup streak in dark lines. She kept looking at the bedroom door like someone might burst through it any second. "The breathing games," she finally whispered. "They started as punishment when Adelaide wouldn't stop crying at night." Her voice got smaller with each word. "But then at the charity gala 6 months ago, this man saw me grab Adelaide's face when she was having a tantrum. She was talking faster now, like once she started, she couldn't stop. He came over later and said he knew about Tom's gambling and the second mortgage we couldn't pay." Marco shifted at the window and held up 2 fingers, which meant 2 minutes since we'd been inside. "He said there were people who would pay good money for well-trained children." Mrs. Sinclair's face twisted up like she might throw up. "I told him he was sick, but he just smiled and said we'd lose the house in 3 months anyway." She started crying harder. "He left his number and I threw it away, but then the bank called about foreclosure proceedings." While she talked, Miguel moved through the room silent as a ghost, checking the closet and under the bed and then slipping out into the hallway. Mrs. Sinclair kept going without even noticing he'd left. The man said the breathing exercises would make them better at following orders and staying quiet. Her voice cracked on the word quiet. He called it conditioning for their new families. I felt sick but kept my face blank. Tell me about this man. She shook her head hard. He just calls himself the handler, and he's maybe 50 with gray hair and expensive suits. Her eyes kept jumping to the door. He runs some kind of private adoption thing for rich people who want kids that won't cause problems. Miguel came back in holding up his phone with a text that said, "Girls gone bathroom wet." My stomach dropped, but I kept focused on Mrs. Sinclair. He took them tonight? She nodded fast. 3 hours ago while Tom was at his poker game. Her voice got even quieter. Said they were going to Mountain House first before the real buyers picked them up tomorrow. Miguel showed me his phone again with pictures of wet towels on the bathroom floor and red marks on the tub edge that looked like blood. There was a syringe wrapper in the trash can and an empty bottle of something I couldn't read from here. Mrs. Sinclair saw my face change and started begging. Please don't call the police because the handler has people everywhere and he'll know right away. She was pulling against the restraints on her wrists. I'll tell you everything if you just let me go, and I promise I'll help you get them back. Marco made a sound that meant, yeah, right. And I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. She'd run the second we let her go, and we'd never see her again. Record her first, Marco said from the window. I pulled out my phone and hit record while Mrs. Sinclair started talking about money like she was reading from a script she'd memorized. $20,000 up front for each child and another $30,000 when they're delivered. Her voice was flat now, like she'd shut off the part of her that could feel things. Extra for special requests like specific training or modifications. She started crying again. We were going to lose everything, and Tom doesn't even know because I wanted to protect him. I kept recording while she talked about the cabin 40 miles north where they kept kids before moving them out of state. The handler took them there tonight, and someone's picking them up at 9 tomorrow morning. I looked at my phone, and it was 2:47 a.m., which meant we had maybe 6 hours. It's off the old logging road past mile marker 31, and there's no cell service for miles. Marco turned from the window. We should go now. But I knew we needed help that wouldn't tip off whoever the handler had in the police department. I pulled up Christina's number and typed, "Need help now, life or death, can't explain yet, please trust me," and hit send. She wrote back in less than a minute with just, "What did you do, Maria?" Miguel had zip ties in his pocket and started securing Mrs. Sinclair to the heavy wooden chair, while she kept insisting her husband didn't know anything. I kept him out of it to protect him from exactly this. But the medical tape on her keyring and the way she'd answered the door in those rubber gloves told me different. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand and we all froze. The screen lit up with a message that said, "Packages secured and stable awaiting morning transfer, confirm receipt." Mrs. Sinclair's face went white. That's him checking in, and if I don't answer, he'll know something's wrong. Marco grabbed the phone. "What do you usually say back?" She whispered, "Confirmed," and Marco typed it and hit send. The phone buzzed again immediately. Small one required extra dose, but responding well to conditioning exercises continuing through night. I wanted to throw the phone against the wall, thinking about what conditioning exercises meant for a 7-year-old girl. Mrs. Sinclair must have seen my face because she started talking fast again. The exercises are just making them hold their breath and stay still and follow commands without asking questions. Her voice was getting higher and more desperate. They're not hurt badly, just trained to be quiet and obedient for their new families who pay extra for well-behaved children. Miguel pulled me aside and showed me more pictures from his search, including Adelaide's stuffed rabbit torn apart in the kitchen trash and what looked like children's clothes with dark stains shoved in a garbage bag. "We need to move," he said quietly. Mrs. Sinclair heard him and started pulling harder against the zip ties. "The cabin has cameras and the handler will see you coming and move them again or worse." My phone started buzzing in my pocket and I pulled it out to see Christina calling instead of texting back. I stepped into the hallway to answer while Marco kept watch over Mrs. Sinclair. "Maria, what the hell did you do?" Christina's voice was tight with worry. I explained everything as fast as I could, from the breathing games to breaking into the house to Mrs. Sinclair tied to a chair. "That's kidnapping and assault. You know that, right?" She was almost yelling now. "Any evidence you get won't be admissible in court and you could go to prison for years." I told her about the handler taking the girls to Mountain House and the morning pickup scheduled in 6 hours. She went quiet for a long moment. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, but this could destroy all our careers." Back in the bedroom, Mrs. Sinclair was talking about the handler's security measures. "He uses burner phones and changes them every week, but I have the current number in my phone." She nodded toward her phone on the nightstand. "I could call him and say there's a problem. Maybe delay things." Marco grabbed the phone before she could say more. "Yeah, right. That would just tip him off and he'd move them somewhere else." He handed me the phone and I started scrolling through her messages while she watched with wide eyes. The texts were all coded, but the meaning was clear enough with references to merchandise and quality assessments and delivery schedules. Then I found the photos folder and my hands started shaking. Adelaide and Penelope posed in different outfits like some sick catalog, their faces blank and eyes empty. There were other kids too, at least a dozen different faces over the past few months. I screenshot everything, my fingers moving fast while rage built in my chest. The front door opened downstairs and we all froze until Christina called out that it was her. She came up the stairs and stopped dead in the doorway, taking in the scene of Mrs. Sinclair zip-tied to the chair with Marco and Miguel standing guard. "Jesus Christ, Maria." She looked ready to walk right back out. I showed her the phone with all the evidence and watched her face change from anger to horror. We need real help. She pulled out her own phone and made a call to someone she trusted at the police department. 20 minutes later, Detective Lawrence Holt showed up alone, off duty and wearing jeans and a sweatshirt. He looked at our little crime scene with professional detachment while Christina explained the situation. "You're all probably going to jail for this." His voice was flat and matter-of-fact. "But let's save the kids first and sort out the legal mess later." He reviewed the evidence on Mrs. Sinclair's phone, his face getting harder with each photo. Then he made his own calls, arranging a welfare check at the Mountain House address while being careful about which departments to involve. Mrs. Sinclair suddenly got more talkative when Holt mentioned federal trafficking charges. There are usually 3 or 4 other children at the cabin at any time, all being prepared for transfer. Her voice was desperate now. The handler has a whole system for moving them out of state to buyers who pay top dollar for trained children. The thought of other kids going through what Adelaide and Penelope endured made my stomach turn. Holt spent the next hour coordinating with state police for the Mountain House raid, avoiding local departments that might have connections to the handler's network. Without proper warrants, this might not hold up in court. He looked at each of us. But saving those children is what matters right now, and we'll deal with the legal problems later. He took our recorded confession and all the phone evidence to establish probable cause for the raid. Marco and Miguel wanted to come to the cabin, but Holt shut that down immediately. "You've done enough damage already, and any more involvement will make prosecution impossible." Marco argued, but Holt wouldn't budge. "Stay here and don't do anything else stupid." Mrs. Sinclair started bargaining for protection, claiming the handler's network had killed people who tried to leave before. "I'll cooperate fully if you guarantee my safety." She couldn't provide names or dates for these supposed murders, but the fear in her eyes looked real. Holt told her witness protection would depend on how valuable her information proved to be. "Right now you're looking at federal trafficking charges, and that's 20 to life." The next 3 hours dragged by with no word from the raid team. Christina stayed with us to make sure we didn't do anything else while Marco paced the room like a caged animal. Miguel kept watch on Mrs. Sinclair, who went back and forth between sobbing about her daughters and calculating her options with cold precision. Every few minutes I checked my phone for updates, but there was nothing. The sun started coming up outside, and I realized the morning pickup time was getting close. If the raid had failed, Adelaide and Penelope would disappear forever into whatever nightmare the handler had planned for them. My phone finally rang at 5:47 a.m., and Holt's voice came through tight with frustration. The cabin was empty, but they found everything else we feared would be there. Children's clothes still warm from bodies, bottles of sedatives lined up on a shelf, leather restraints attached to bed frames, and a logbook with dates and inventory numbers going back months. The handler had cleared out maybe an hour before the raid team arrived, which meant someone had warned him. Mrs. Sinclair started shaking her head violently when I looked at her, swearing she hadn't contacted anyone. But then her eyes went wide, and she admitted her husband always checked on her before his morning run at 6 a.m. Holt cursed and immediately sent units to pick up Mr. Sinclair at their house. But when they got there, his car was already gone, and neighbors said he'd left around 4 in the morning. The net was getting bigger, but Adelaide and Penelope were still missing, and every minute that passed meant they could be crossing state lines or worse. A traffic camera near the cabin had caught the handler's white van heading south on Route 9 2 hours earlier, and Holt started coordinating with Highway Patrol to set up roadblocks on every major route heading toward the state line. The problem was there were dozens of back roads, and covering them all would take resources they didn't have, especially since they still had to keep this off official channels to avoid tipping off the handler's contacts. Mrs. Sinclair suddenly sat up straighter and said she remembered something the handler mentioned once about a backup location, an abandoned motel off Route 47 that used to be called the Pine Rest Inn, where they'd take kids when the cabin got too hot, though she'd never been there herself and didn't know the exact address. Holt got on his radio immediately, pulling units from the roadblocks to converge on Route 47, while keeping the information compartmentalized to trusted officers only. I couldn't just sit there anymore watching Mrs. Sinclair cry and Marco pace, so I asked Christina if we could go through CPS files at her office to look for patterns. She hesitated but agreed, and we left Miguel watching Mrs. Sinclair while we drove to the county building that was just opening for the day. Christina logged into the system, and we started searching for families who'd suddenly relocated after concerning reports were filed, focusing on the areas where the handler might operate. Within an hour, we'd found 3 other families who'd vanished right after CPS visits, all with similar stories about business opportunities out of state, all with young children who'd shown signs of abuse. The pattern was clear and horrifying, suggesting this network had been operating for years with help from people inside the system who could flag problematic reports. Christina made a call to Jordan Rhodes, an investigative journalist she'd worked with before on corruption stories, and asked him to meet us at a coffee shop down the street. Jordan arrived within 20 minutes, and after we showed him Mrs. Sinclair's recorded confession and the evidence we'd gathered, his face went pale. He agreed to sit on the story until the children were safe, but started making calls to his own sources to verify what we were telling him, saying public pressure might be the only way to break through the political protection this network enjoyed. His editor was already interested based on the initial details, and Jordan said he could have a story ready to publish within hours of getting the green light. That's when Holt called with the news we'd been praying for. They'd found the white van parked behind the abandoned Pine Rest Inn, and tactical units were surrounding the building. The thermal imaging showed 5 heat signatures inside, 2 small ones that had to be children and they were preparing to breach. The next few minutes would determine if Adelaide and Penelope would come home alive, or if we'd been too late. I grabbed Christina's hand, and we both held our breath listening to Holt's radio traffic as the tactical team moved into position. The team leader counted down, and then we heard the crash of doors breaking and officers shouting commands. There was screaming and what sounded like a window breaking. Then the team leader's voice came through saying they had 4 children secured, but the adult suspect had escaped through a bathroom window. Holt confirmed Adelaide and Penelope were among the rescued kids, along with 2 other children who looked to be around 7 or 8 years old. All 4 were sedated but breathing, and paramedics were already on scene starting IVs and checking vitals. The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down on the curb outside the coffee shop, my whole body shaking as the adrenaline crashed. Christina was crying and hugging me while Jordan took notes, already working on his story's lead paragraph. Holt called back to say the paramedics were transporting all 4 children to the county hospital, and the motel room was a goldmine of evidence. The handler had left behind detailed transaction records going back 3 years, including coded names of buyers and sellers, pickup locations, and payment amounts. There were photographs of at least 20 different children with inventory numbers written on the backs, and a laptop that the tech team was already working to crack. This was bigger than just the Sinclairs, bigger than we'd imagined, and the evidence would take months to fully process. At the hospital, the emergency room went into lockdown as the children arrived, with security guards posted at every entrance to prevent any interference. Adelaide and Penelope were conscious but confused, asking where their mommy was and when they could go home, not understanding that their mother was the reason they were here. The other 2 children were in worse shape, showing signs of long-term abuse and malnutrition that suggested they'd been in the system for months. Child psychologists arrived to begin gentle assessments while Christina started the paperwork for emergency custody orders that would keep the girls safe while the legal system sorted everything out. The social worker handed Mrs. Sinclair a phone to call her lawyer, while 2 officers stood guard at the hospital room door. She broke down completely when the social worker explained she wouldn't see Adelaide and Penelope again without court supervision. Her hands shook as she wrote down passwords for her home computer, desperate to show she was cooperating now that everything was falling apart. The detectives found encrypted files on her laptop within an hour, hundreds of documents about other children and transactions going back 3 years. Meanwhile, officers arrested Mr. Sinclair at his downtown office where he was trying to shred papers when they walked in. He kept saying he didn't know anything about what his wife had done, but the detective showed him bank records with deposits he couldn't explain. His gambling debts had disappeared 6 months ago, right when the first big payment came through. Within hours, his story fell apart, and he asked for his lawyer. The other 2 kids we found at the motel turned out to be runaways from different states who'd been missing for months. One was from Texas, the other from Arizona, both grabbed at bus stations when they were trying to get away from bad home situations. Their families had given up looking, which is exactly what the handler counted on. The reunification process would take weeks of paperwork and verification, but at least they had somewhere to go home to eventually. Alejandra Acevedo from the district attorney's office showed up at the hospital the next morning and immediately took over the whole case. She recognized this was way bigger than just the Sinclairs and started pulling in federal resources. She offered Mrs. Sinclair a cooperation deal in exchange for testimony about the network, though she made it clear prison time was happening no matter what. The focus shifted to finding everyone involved in buying and selling kids. 2 days later, Detective Holt called to warn me they were coming to arrest me. I was at the nonprofit when the officers showed up with handcuffs, charging me with kidnapping and assault just like he'd predicted. Christina had already lined up Sushma Hendricks as my defense attorney, who met me at the station and started arguing I was preventing imminent harm to children. She thought we could plead down to misdemeanors, but my career in child psychology was definitely over. Marco and Miguel got arrested the same day, but their charges were lighter because of their military service and the fact they were just helping me. The prosecutor offered them community service instead of jail time, and Marco joked that explaining this to our mother would be worse than any prison sentence. They both took the deals immediately. Jordan Rhodes published his first article about the case 3 days later, being careful not to include details that might mess up the investigation. The public went crazy demanding answers about how this network operated for so long without anyone stopping it. City council members started distancing themselves from the Sinclairs, and the political protections started falling apart. Adelaide and Penelope got placed with a foster family that specialized in trauma cases, while the courts figured out long-term placement. The psychologists said their therapy would take years, but they were optimistic the girls could recover with the right support. Adelaide kept asking when she could go home, not understanding that home wasn't safe anymore. The encrypted files from Mrs. Sinclair's computer revealed 12 more children sold over the past 3 years, shipped to buyers across the country. Federal agencies joined the investigation, and suddenly our local case became a national trafficking probe. The handler's real name finally surfaced in the files, and it turned out he was already wanted in 3 other states for similar crimes. 3 months later, Mrs. Sinclair stood in court and pleaded guilty to child endangerment and trafficking charges. The judge gave her 15 years with possibility of parole in 7 if she kept cooperating with investigators. She'd serve her time in protective custody because the handler's associates had already made threats against anyone who talked. Her cooperation was helping dismantle the whole network, but it wouldn't save her from prison. The next morning, I got the call from the hospital's HR department telling me not to come in for my shift. My supervisor's voice was cold when she explained that pending the investigation into my criminal charges, I was suspended without pay, and my professional license was under immediate review by the state board. Walking through the hospital lobby to clean out my office felt like walking through mud, with every colleague I'd worked with for 5 years suddenly finding reasons to look at their phones or duck into patient rooms when they saw me coming. The security guard, who always joked with me about the weather, just nodded and looked away as I carried my box of personal items to my car. Christina called me that afternoon from her own review board hearing where they grilled her for 3 hours about why she helped coordinate with a kidnapper instead of following proper channels. She kept her job but got an official reprimand in her file that would follow her forever, though she said saving 4 kids were worth any mark on her record. She started checking on me every day after that, bringing coffee and sitting with me while I filled out unemployment forms and tried to figure out how to pay rent without a job. 3 weeks crawled by with depositions and meetings with Sushma about my case when Detective Holt called with news that made me drop my phone. The handler had been caught trying to cross into Canada with fake papers and a van full of files about new targets he was scouting in Montreal. The border agents found detailed notes about vulnerable kids at homeless shelters and foster care facilities, proving he was planning to start the whole sick operation again in a new country. The trial prep consumed every waking hour for the next month as Sushma walked me through what to expect in court. She negotiated with the prosecutor for hours, finally getting them to agree to drop the kidnapping charge if I pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment, which meant 2 years probation and mandatory counseling but no prison time. The criminal record would destroy any chance of working with kids professionally again, but at least I'd stay free. Mr. Sinclair's lawyer contacted Sushma trying to work out some deal where he'd testify against his wife in exchange for dropped charges, but the feds already had him cold on the money laundering. They found records showing he'd personally signed the lease for the Mountain House cabin and made regular cash deposits that matched the handler's payment schedule. He took a plea for 8 years in federal prison, crying in court about how he was just trying to provide for his family. Adelaide and Penelope's foster mom sent updates through Christina since I wasn't allowed direct contact as part of my bail conditions. Adelaide was finally sleeping without nightmares and had started eating regular meals again instead of hiding food in her room. Penelope spoke for the first time in weeks, just asking for a glass of water, but it was progress. Their aunt from Oregon passed all the background checks and home studies, getting approved as their permanent guardian, which meant the girls could stay with actual family instead of bouncing through the system. The investigation into the charity where Mrs. Sinclair first met the handler turned up connections to 3 board members who'd been getting kickbacks for referring vulnerable families. 2 of them resigned immediately and fled the state while the 3rd hired the most expensive lawyer in the city and started fighting every subpoena. The whole power structure that protected these monsters was finally cracking apart. My first therapy session with Imogen Douglas felt like sitting in the principal's office, explaining how I'd gone from respected psychologist to criminal defendant in one night. She didn't judge, but helped me see how my own trauma from Uncle Harold had driven me to save Adelaide and Penelope at any cost, even if that cost was my entire career. We met twice a week for months, slowly unpacking why I couldn't wait for the system to work, and how to live with both the pride of saving those girls and the shame of becoming a criminal to do it. 6 months after that night at the Sinclair house, I was stocking shelves at a nonprofit that helped trafficking survivors, making barely above minimum wage but feeling useful again. My psychology degree meant I could help with intake interviews and support groups, even if I couldn't practice officially anymore. The other staff knew my story and treated me like a hero instead of a criminal, which helped on the days when I wondered if I'd thrown my life away. Marco and Miguel finished their 100 hours of community service at the veterans shelter where they'd been assigned, but they kept showing up even after their time was done. Marco said helping other vets who were struggling gave him purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the service. Miguel started dating one of the counselors there and joked that getting arrested was the best thing that ever happened to him. That night in the Sinclair house had changed all our lives in ways we never expected. Some bad, but some surprisingly good. The trial started 8 months later in a packed courtroom where survivors from across the country came to testify against the handler. I sat in the gallery every single day watching as prosecutor after prosecutor laid out evidence from his records showing he'd been selling children for 15 years. The boxes of files they wheeled in contained photos and transaction logs and coded messages about kids as young as 4. Witnesses described training sessions where he taught buyers how to break children's spirits without leaving marks. One woman who'd escaped at 16 showed scars on her arms from the zip ties he used. The defense tried arguing mental illness, but the jury saw through it when they played recordings of him negotiating prices like he was selling cars. After 3 weeks of testimony, the verdict came back guilty on all 47 counts. The judge gave him life without parole, and I watched his face go white as they led him away in chains. 6 weeks after the verdict, Adelaide and Penelope went to see their mother in prison for the first time. I wasn't allowed to be there, but their therapist told me later how Adelaide kept asking why Mommy lived in this sad gray building now. Penelope understood more and spent most of the visit staring at the table while their mother cried and apologized over and over. The girls drew pictures for her that the guards had to check for contraband before passing them through the glass. Their aunt said Adelaide had nightmares for a week after, but Penelope seemed calmer somehow, like seeing her mother locked up helped her understand she was really safe now. Jordan Rhodes called me the day his story won the Polk Award for investigative journalism. He'd spent months tracking down every lead and interviewing dozens of people to expose how deep the trafficking network went. The prize came with $20,000 that he immediately donated to a group that helps trafficking survivors get therapy and job training. His articles led to new state laws requiring better background checks for private adoption agencies and more funding for CPS investigators. 3 senators cited his work when they passed federal legislation increasing penalties for child trafficking. My first meeting with my probation officer happened in a dingy government building that smelled like old coffee and despair. She looked at my file and said she understood why I did what I did, even if the law couldn't allow it. Instead of treating me like a criminal, she helped me figure out how to rebuild my life within the restrictions of my probation. She connected me with nonprofits that would hire someone with a record and wrote letters supporting my applications. Every month when I checked in, she asked about the girls and reminded me that protecting children were still possible through legal channels. Christina got her promotion 6 months after everything went down. The department created a whole new unit focused on preventing trafficking, and she was the obvious choice to run it. She hired investigators and social workers who understood that sometimes the system needed to move faster than bureaucracy usually allowed. We met for coffee every week, and she'd update me on cases they were working while I helped her understand the psychology of both victims and predators. She joked that our insane night breaking into the Sinclair house had somehow become the best career move she ever made, though we both knew the real heroes were the kids who survived. The nonprofit where I'd been volunteering offered me a real position running their survivor services program. The pay was barely enough to cover rent, but it meant I could use my psychology training to actually help kids heal from trauma. My first day in the role, I met with a 13-year-old who'd been rescued from a trafficking ring in Texas. She didn't talk for the first 3 sessions, but eventually started opening up about the breathing exercises they made her do. Every child I worked with reminded me why that night at the Sinclair house had been worth losing everything else. One afternoon, a package arrived at the nonprofit with no return address. Inside was a piece of construction paper with a rainbow drawn in crayon and flowers that looked like colorful explosions. At the bottom, in shaky kid handwriting, it said, "Thank you," with Adelaide's name underneath. Her foster parents included a note saying she didn't really remember that scary night, but knew I was someone who helped her when she needed it most. I framed that drawing and hung it above my desk where I could see it every morning. Whenever I doubted whether I'd made the right choice that night, Adelaide's rainbow reminded me that some things matter more than careers or criminal records. Detective Holt reached out through official channels a year after the trial to share an update. Using information from the handler's records, they'd identified and recovered 12 more children from buyers across 6 states. Some had been missing for years, and their families had given up hope. He thanked me for starting the investigation, even though my methods were illegal, and said sometimes doing the right thing and doing the legal thing weren't the same. His letter was formal, but between the lines, I could read respect from one person who protected kids to another. My mandatory counseling was supposed to end after a year, but I kept seeing Imogen every month anyway. She helped me understand that my need to save Adelaide and Penelope came from my own trauma with Uncle Harold, and how I wished someone had saved me and Marco back then. We worked through the guilt of becoming a criminal, and the anger at a system that protected predators with money and connections. She taught me that healing wasn't a straight line, and that choosing to break the law to save those girls didn't make me a bad person, even if it made me a criminal in the eyes of the law. 2 years after that night, everything changed. Adelaide and Penelope were living with their aunt in Oregon, going to regular school like normal kids. Their aunt sent updates through Christina showing them at birthday parties and soccer games and just being regular children again. Adelaide's hair had grown back from where her mother had cut it during one of the punishment games, and Penelope had started playing violin in the school orchestra. They still went to therapy every week, but their therapist said they were making amazing progress. The girls who once practiced holding their breath underwater for 73 seconds were learning to just be kids again. 3 months later, I was walking past the old Sinclair house when I saw the "For Sale" sign had a "Sold" sticker across it. A moving truck sat in the driveway, and a young couple was carrying boxes inside while their 2 kids ran around the front yard playing tag. The little girl looked about Adelaide's age, and seeing her laugh in that same spot where I'd found the mutilated doll made my chest feel tight. The mom waved at me as I passed, and I waved back, knowing they had no idea what happened in those rooms. Around the same time, I got a letter from the state university saying they'd reviewed my application for their social work graduate program. My hands shook opening it because my criminal record was right there on the application, but they accepted me anyway with a note saying my experience could bring valuable perspective to the program. The classes started in fall, which gave me 6 months to save up money from my nonprofit job. Marco called me one Saturday to tell me about this nurse he met at the veterans shelter where he did his community service. Her name was Elena, and she understood why he'd helped me that night because her own sister had been hurt as a kid. They started having coffee after their volunteer shifts, and within a month they were dating for real. Seeing him smile again after everything we went through made me realize we could actually move past this. Then one afternoon, a thick envelope arrived at the nonprofit from a law firm downtown. Inside was a handwritten letter from Mrs. Sinclair saying she was sorry for what she put her daughters through and thanking me for saving them, even though it meant she lost everything. I read it 3 times before putting it in my desk drawer without responding because some things don't need answers. The news came through Jordan Rhodes first, since he'd been following every development. The federal prosecutors had finished all the trafficking cases connected to the Handlers Network, with 47 people going to prison across 6 different states. What started with Adelaide telling me about the breathing game had taken down an entire criminal organization that had been hurting kids for over a decade. 2 years passed before I walked across that graduation stage with my social work degree. The nonprofit had already offered me the clinical director position, which meant I could help design programs for kids who'd been through trauma like Adelaide and Penelope. My record would always follow me, but at least now I could use what I learned to help other kids without breaking into anyone's house. Every December, Adelaide and Penelope's aunt would send me a Christmas card with photos showing how much they'd grown. The most recent one showed them in soccer uniforms with huge smiles and medals around their necks. Adelaide was 13 now and Penelope 15, both doing great in the school according to their aunt's note. They still went to therapy every week, but their therapist said they were some of the most resilient kids she'd ever worked with. The aunt mentioned they were looking at colleges for Penelope, and Adelaide wanted to be a veterinarian, which made me smile because she'd always loved animals, even during the worst times. Sometimes late at night, I'd think about that moment I decided to call Marco instead of waiting for the system to work. The smart thing would have been to keep pushing through proper channels and document everything carefully. But Adelaide and Penelope would have disappeared forever if I'd done the smart thing. They would have ended up sold to strangers who wanted broken kids they could control. Instead, they got to grow up safe with their aunt, play soccer, go to the school and plan for college like normal teenagers. My criminal record and lost career seemed like a small price for giving them that chance. The system that was supposed to protect them had failed completely because money and connections mattered more than children's safety. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that you'll be punished for it. I made peace with that trait a long time ago and would make the same choice again tomorrow. Thanks for wandering through all of this with me. It's been really interesting sharing these moments together. I'll catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.